We'll start, though, in Minnesota, where there was another night of protests following the police-involved shooting of Daunte Wright. Hundreds of people, most of them peaceful, gathered outside of the Brooklyn Center Police Department for a fourth night in a row. Authorities say some people in the crowd were shooting fireworks and throwing objects at law enforcement, leading police to declare an unlawful assembly. Protesters were told to disperse several times, and by 10:30, many had left. Authorities say some of the remaining protesters were arrested, but the night was much calmer than what we saw earlier this week. Willie?
Meanwhile, the former police officer who fatally shot Daunte Wright has been charged with second-degree manslaughter. Authorities say Kim Potter, a 26-year veteran of the Brooklyn Center Police Department, was taken into custody around 11:30 a.m. yesterday. Sheriff's records show she posted $100,000 bail and was released from custody shortly after 5:30 p.m. The second-degree manslaughter charge carries a maximum penalty of 10 years behind bars if she is convicted, Mika.
Let's bring in civil rights attorney and former Brooklyn, New York prosecutor, Charles Coleman. This one, Charles, I'd love for you to just give me your gut on the charges against Kim Potter and also the events that led up to the shooting of Daunte Wright. Should they be looked at as closely as the actual shooting?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. I think that when you start looking at the charges, particularly with respect to the manslaughter charge that which Potter has been currently charged with, what you have to basically surmise is that the prosecution here is already playing it safe. What they are doing is they are eliminating the element of intent by making the top count basically a charge that requires negligence, not a charge that requires intent. So basically the statute as it reads suggests that in order for her to be convicted, they have to establish that she was negligent in her duty, which basically will come down to a question of reasonableness of care or reasonableness as compared to whatever the standard of the law is. And so the question, if the indictment stays what it is, if the charges say what they are, the question will remain, was it reasonable for a 26-year-old veteran, 26-year veteran on the police force to take their taser for their service weapon? And I think that is, for the prosecution, already playing it very, very safe in this regard.
You know, Charles, it's so interesting you said that, because when we first get the news, and of course we didn't say any of this on the air, but you just assume, okay, there was a scuffle, somebody mistook their weapons. My original thought was, oh my gosh, this is a terrible lack of training. This is somebody new on the police force. But the fact that this was a veteran, someone who had been around 26 years, even if it was a tragic accident, there is certainly, with a 26-year veteran, a standard of care that you would expect far differently than a rookie cop in that same position.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on in terms of that assessment. But I would also say that, quite frankly, we are having the wrong conversation about whether she should have drawn her service weapon or whether she should have drawn the taser. At the end of the day, the question remains for me, stepping back from this situation a bit more, is why was there a need to use any sort of weapon or escalate the level of force being used for what amounted to a traffic stop for warrants? This was a misdemeanor warrant that Mr. Wright had. He should be here today. And quite frankly, I'm not necessarily convinced that the situation warranted that course of action. Now, reasonable minds may disagree on that point. However, I think it's deeply problematic when you start looking systemically at what has happened in the state of Minnesota regarding police force and civilians and the use of force there. So while I do appreciate the fact, and I also agree with you, that 26 years on the force should have invoked a greater sense of awareness in that situation, I'm yet to be convinced that was even needed in terms of apprehending Mr. Wright for this misdemeanor warrant.
Well, and Mika talked about the chain of events a minute ago. Those chain of events that we look at, you question why 3 police officers even approached a vehicle for an expired tag. That fatal shooting of Daunte Wright, of course, began with a traffic stop for a minor infraction. Wright was pulled over Sunday while driving an SUV. According to then Chief Tim Gannon of the Brooklyn Center Police Department, It was a traffic violation related to an expired registration tab.
From what I've understood from the public safety briefing, there was an expired registration on the vehicle. That means the tabs were expired.
Now, according to the Star Tribune, Minnesota law forbids motorists from driving without current license tabs. But the paper also notes the deadly coronavirus pandemic has not slowed policing of these low-level offenses in recent months. Minnesota law does not allow a grace period when the license tabs are expired. The brightly colored stickers are no longer valid 10 days after the month listed on the registration plate. Gannon never said, though, when the tabs were lapsed on Wright's car. Why am I bringing this up? I mean, because while the policing of such offenses is not slowed, it does appear the process for getting those tab renewals have slowed down. A Minnesota Department of Vehicle Services spokeswoman told the Star Tribune last summer the agency is behind on processing mailed-in tab and license plate renewals for thousands of Minnesotans.
Like across the country because of the pandemic,
Because of the pandemic. At the time, she said many delayed requests were due in part because staff was telecommuting and did not have access to the mailed-in documents. More, there's a lot more we could talk about there. The thing that I've just not been able to come to terms with, and I say it here all the time, you know, Chauvin, he had 9.5 minutes. He knew what he was doing. He saw a man slowly die in front of him. We often see scuffles. We see police officers making terrible mistakes, people getting hurt or dying because of it. And that will be tried in court. And I'll just say now, I suspect that a jury would probably have problems even charging this officer with negligent homicide. But let's step back. Why? Well, hold on. Excuse me one second. Here's a question. I'm sorry it's taking me so long to get to it. Why did 3 officers in the middle of the Derek Chauvin trial, 10 miles away from where that trial was being held, in an area that had a history of problems with race relations regarding policing, why did 3 officers feel the need to go up to a car with an expired tab? I mean, you talk about a lack of situational awareness. It's remarkable to me that they said, oh, this is what we're going to do this afternoon. We're going to pull somebody over with an expired tab when we know that a lot of those tabs are expired because of COVID.
You know, the answer to your question, Joe, is unfortunately across America, police officers in those situations are often doing the job that the public has hired them to do. And I don't say that to be tongue in cheek. I mean that with all sincerity. I mean, you have a couple of things going on here. In some cases, you have officers who are bad actors, who need to be brought to justice. And then in other cases, I think this is the majority of cases across America, and certainly here in New York that I've covered in my career as a journalist, you have a situation where police officers are essentially set up along with the people that they come into interaction with, in many cases, to have these bad interactions that too often end in the loss of life of Black Americans who should still be with us. And so we really have to ask ourselves, what kinds of jobs do we want police officers doing? For example, do we want police officers being entrusted with policing, I don't know, homeless people for sitting on benches? Do we want them entrusted with pulling out guns instead of tasers at routine traffic stops? I mean, if this had happened in Europe, first of all, it wouldn't have. But the question we should be asking is, why are guns so readily available in the United States? Why are police departments so heavily militarized? It's not just the training, right? It's the culture of the way that we use police departments and the history of how we have used police departments in this country, which is heavily militarized and too often to police the bodies of those who are Black, brown, and part of labor movement. And so I think that really needs to be part of the conversation here. And I don't know what was in Officer Potter's heart, but I do have a lot of empathy for the officers who are put in these situations as well, because ultimately, sometimes they are set up to fail. And that is no excuse. There should be personal accountability. But why are we putting all of this on individual officers only? There needs to be a larger conversation, I believe, about reform that doesn't just focus on officer behavior, but also focuses on the entire process by which we have empowered people, in some cases with very little training, and in other cases with very little accountability, to make life and death decisions before the judge and jury have weighed in.